They rationed bread to slices thinner than a coin. They simmered bone broth until every trace of marrow was gone. And when even that ran out, they turned to meals most of us wouldn't recognize as food today. These weren't quaint old recipes from dusty cookbooks. They were survival codes. Born in blackout kitchens on scorched farmland and in bombed-out cities where stores stayed empty for months. Every ingredient had to earn its place. Every scrap had to be stretched, preserved, or transformed into something that could keep a body working one more day. Flour was cut with ground acorns. Potatoes were fermented to last the winter. And wild plants became the difference between hunger and strength. 80 years later, these recipes are vanishing. But in the next crisis, they might be the only ones that still work. Subscribe now, before the last generation that remembers them is gone. Number 1. Acorn flour bread. When flour disappeared from shelves during WWII, rural families didn't wait for it to return. They went into the forests. Acorns, usually ignored as animal feed, became one of the most reliable wheat substitutes. They were abundant, free, and could be stored for months in sacks without spoiling. But eating them raw was impossible. Their bitter tannins made them inedible and hard on the stomach. The solution was centuries old, but wartime brought it back. First, the acorns were shelled and crushed. The coarse meal was soaked in cold water, sometimes for days, with the water changed several times. This leached out the tannins, leaving a mild, nutty base. Once drained and dried, the meal was ground fine with hand mills or even improvised stone grinders. Families then mixed it with whatever small amount of wheat or rye flour they still had. This blend made the bread lighter and easier to rise, while still stretching supplies far beyond what pure wheat could allow. The dough was dense. It rose slowly and baked into heavy loaves with a dark, earthy flavor. But it kept well, often lasting up to a week without going stale, especially when wrapped in cloth. In regions with no access to any grain at all, the bread was made from pure acorn flour. It was thicker, sometimes crumbly, but still filling. Families ate it plain, dipped it in soup, or toasted it over open fires. Acorn bread wasn't just about replacing wheat, it was about independence. It meant that even when supply lines failed, the forest could still fill the table. It required no fields, no trade, and no permission. Only knowledge, passed quietly from older generations who remembered harder times before the war. Its limits were clear. Processing took patience. Skipping the soaking made it bitter and harsh. But those who mastered it could turn a basket of acorns into weeks of bread. Today, most walk past acorns without a second thought. Back then, each one was a piece of stored sunlight, waiting to be turned into survival. Would you see food where others see nothing? Subscribe, and keep the skills that turn scarcity into strength. Number 2, nettle soup. When winter ended and snow melted into the soil, most wartime gardens were still bare. Seedlings had not yet matured. Stored potatoes were nearly gone. It was the hungry gap, the weeks when last year's harvest had been eaten, but the new one was far from ready. For rural families, survival often came from a plant most would avoid touching, the stinging nettle. In early spring, nettles emerged before almost anything else. Their young leaves were packed with iron, calcium, and vitamin C, all nutrients in short supply after months of preserved food. But they came with one problem: their sting. Wartime cooks knew the answer. They gathered only the tender tops, wearing gloves or using cloth sacks. Once home, the leaves were washed thoroughly and boiled for several minutes. Heat neutralized the stinging hairs, leaving a mild, spinach-like green. The classic method was simple. A pot of water or broth was brought to a boil. Chopped potatoes, barley, or turnips were added for body. The nettles went in last, cooked just enough to soften and release their flavor. Some added onions or leeks if available. A pinch of salt, precious but worth it, finished the dish. In Britain's countryside, nettle soup was sometimes thickened with a spoonful of oatmeal, turning it into a filling porridge-like meal. In rural France, a dash of vinegar or foraged wild garlic might be added for depth. This soup wasn't a luxury. It was a bridge between scarcity and plenty. It kept energy levels up when rations were thin and gardens empty. And it could be made in less than half an hour, even over an open fire. The limits were seasonal. After flowering, nettles became tough and unpleasant to eat. But during that brief spring window, they were a free, renewable food source that cost nothing but the effort to collect. Today, nettles are often seen as weeds to be cleared. Back then, they were the first green hope after months of cold. A reminder that survival often begins with what nature offers freely, if you know when and how to take it. Would you harvest the weeds in your field, or walk past your next meal? Subscribe, and keep alive the skills that see food where others see nothing. Number 3. Mock coffee from roasted barley. For many, coffee was more than a drink. It was a comfort, a ritual, and a rare moment of warmth during long, cold mornings. But during World War II, imported coffee beans vanished from rural markets almost overnight. Blockades, rationing, and fuel shortages cut off supply lines, and for millions, the familiar aroma of morning coffee became just a memory. That's when an old peasant trick returned: roasted barley coffee. It wasn't true coffee. There was no caffeine, no exotic beans from overseas, but it offered something nearly as valuable: a rich, roasted flavor, and the sense of normalcy in a time when daily life had been stripped to essentials. The process was simple, but required patience. Barley grains were cleaned and spread in a shallow pan or metal tray. Over a wood stove or open fire, they were stirred constantly until they turned a deep, even brown. Too little roasting, and the flavor would be grassy. Too much, and it became bitter and burnt. Once cooled, the roasted grains were ground, sometimes in a hand mill, sometimes crushed with a rolling pin on a wooden board. The coarse grounds were then brewed exactly like coffee. A few spoonfuls simmered in water until the liquid turned dark and fragrant. Some households mixed in roasted chicory root or even acorns to deepen the flavor. Others added a pinch of sugar or a splash of milk when they could afford it, though most drank it plain. In many rural kitchens, the barley coffee pot sat at the back of the stove all day, ready for anyone coming in from the fields. It wasn't about caffeine. It was about holding on to a small daily tradition, something familiar in a world that had changed beyond recognition. Its limits were clear: no energy boost, no stimulant kick to push through fatigue, but it kept morale steady, and morale was as important to survival as food itself. Today, few would think to replace coffee with roasted grain. But for wartime families, it was a lesson in adaptation. When you can't have the real thing, you make something that serves the same purpose. And you make it with what's in reach. Would you find a substitute when your comforts vanish, or go without? Number 4, fermented cabbage, sauerkraut. During wartime winters, fresh vegetables were almost impossible to find. Gardens lay dormant under frost. Supply trucks rarely reached rural areas, and vitamin deficiencies became a serious threat. Cabbage, however, offered a solution, not because it stayed fresh for months, but because it could be transformed into something that lasted the entire winter without losing its nutritional value: sauerkraut. The method was deceptively simple. Cabbage heads were shredded thin and layered into wooden barrels or ceramic crocks. Each layer was sprinkled with coarse salt, which drew out moisture and created a natural brine. No vinegar, no preservatives, only cabbage, salt, and thyme. Once packed, the cabbage was pressed down with a weight. Within days, natural bacteria began fermentation. The sourness deepened over weeks while the vitamin C content remained high. This was crucial. It helped prevent scurvy, a real danger when diets lacked fresh produce. In farming villages, barrels of sauerkraut were kept in root cellars or unheated sheds. Even in freezing temperatures, the fermentation slowed but didn't stop, meaning the kraut stayed safe to eat. Families could scoop out what they needed, then press the rest back under the brine. It wasn't just eaten as a side dish. Sauerkraut was added to stews for flavor and nutrients, mixed with potatoes for a hearty meal, or served with small cuts of meat to stretch rations further. Its limits were clear. It required planning. Cabbage had to be harvested before hard frost and preserved before it spoiled. And while its sour flavor was loved by many, others ate it only because there was no alternative. Yet it was a survival powerhouse. It provided a steady source of vitamins through months when diets otherwise relied on dried grains and salted meat. It could be made in bulk with no special equipment, and it turned a perishable crop into a year-round resource. Today, sauerkraut is sold in jars on store shelves, but the knowledge to make it from scratch, in a barrel without electricity, is fading. For those who lived through World War II, it wasn't a delicacy. It was a shield against hunger and illness. Would you wait for help, or prepare food that needs no one's permission to last? Number 5. Potato pancakes, Kartoffelpuffer. In wartime Europe, potatoes were more than a side dish. They were a lifeline. Easy to grow, hardy in poor soil, and storable for months in cellars, they became the backbone of many rural diets. But after a long winter, boiled potatoes could feel monotonous. That's when families turned to a versatile filling dish, potato pancakes. Known in Germany as Kartoffelpuffer, and in other regions by local names, these pancakes used minimal ingredients. Potatoes were grated by hand into a coarse pulp. A small amount of flour was added, sometimes just a spoonful, to bind the mixture. If eggs were available, they went in. If not, a bit of leftover starch water did the job. Salt and onion were added for flavor when rations allowed. The mixture was shaped into thin patties and fried in whatever fat could be found. Lard, drippings, or even a little oil saved from previous meals. Cooking over an open pan gave them crisp edges and a soft, hearty center. Potato pancakes offered more than variety. They concentrated calories, making a small portion of potatoes go further. They could be eaten hot right from the pan or cooled and carried to the fields for a midday meal. In some homes, they were served with a spoonful of preserved applesauce, adding sweetness when it was available. Their limits came down to fuel and fat. Frying required both, and in hard times, that meant using them sparingly. Still, many considered the occasional plate of crisp potato pancakes a morale booster worth the cost. Today, versions of these pancakes still appear in comfort food menus worldwide. But during World War II, they were not a treat. They were a way to make one staple crop stretch into something satisfying, portable, and filling. It was another example of turning the ordinary into the essential, using simple skills to bring warmth to the table in the coldest months. Would you know how to turn one ingredient into a dozen meals? Number 6. Dandelion salad. When spring arrived in wartime countryside, it didn't bring overflowing gardens or markets filled with fresh produce. It brought fields dotted with yellow flowers, dandelions. While many today see them as weeds, wartime families saw them as free food. The young leaves, gathered before the flowers fully opened, were tender and packed with vitamins A and C. Nutrients often missing from diets after long winters of dried grains and salted meats. Collecting them required no tools, only a keen eye. Leaves were picked in the early morning before the sun made them bitter. They were rinsed in cold water, sometimes several times, to wash away grit and insects. The simplest version was eaten raw. Leaves were chopped and dressed with vinegar, oil, or even just a pinch of salt. If onions were available, thin slices were mixed in for flavor. Some households blanched the leaves briefly in boiling water to reduce bitterness, then tossed them with boiled potatoes for a more filling dish. In regions where vinegar was scarce, families used fermented pickle brine as dressing, a clever way to add tang while conserving scarce supplies. The salad's strength lay in its accessibility. It grew everywhere, in gardens, along roads, even in abandoned fields. It needed no cultivation, no planting, and no care. In times when ration lines were long and shops were bare, it could be gathered and eaten within the hour. Its limit was seasonal. Once the flowers matured, the leaves became tough and unpleasantly bitter. This meant families learned to recognize the short window of freshness and took full advantage while it lasted. Today, dandelions are often sprayed away or ignored. But in World War II, they were a seasonal gift, a burst of fresh greens at a time when fresh food was a rare luxury. It was proof that survival didn't always require a farm or a shop. Sometimes it just required knowing that the ground beneath your feet was already feeding you. Would you walk past a meal growing in plain sight? Number 7, meat stretch stew. In wartime kitchens, meat was rare. Ration coupons limited how much a family could buy, and many weeks passed with none available at all. When a small cut did make it to the table, it was never cooked alone. It was stretched. The method was simple in concept, but vital in practice, and a small portion of meat, sometimes no more than a handful of scraps or bones, was simmered slowly with whatever vegetables and grains were on hand. Carrots, onions, turnips, and cabbage were common. Barley, oats, or beans were added for bulk and sustenance. The goal was to let the meat flavor the entire pot, so every ladle carried the taste of something that couldn't be afforded in quantity. Slow cooking broke down tough cuts, releasing every bit of flavor and nutrition into the broth. Even the bones were boiled, stripped in abtante, and returned to the pot before being discarded. In rural villages, these stews often cooked on the edge of the stove all day, ready to be eaten whenever someone returned from work in the fields. Leftovers were reheated the next day, often tasting richer as the flavors deepened. Its strength was economy. One small cut could feed 6 or more people when paired with enough vegetables and grain. It kept everyone warm and full during cold months when calories meant energy for work. Its limits were clear. It couldn't exist without at least some meat to start with. But even the smallest amount could be stretched far when handled carefully. Today, meat stretch stew survives in countless variations: farmhouse soups, peasant broths, and one-pot meals that seem more like comfort food than survival tactics. Yet for those who lived through the shortages of WWII, it was a practical formula. Never waste, always extend, and make every ingredient serve as much of the table as possible. It was a lesson in humility and resourcefulness, turning scarcity into something hearty enough to keep a family strong. Would you know how to turn a handful into a feast? Number 8, fruit leather from windfall apples. In wartime, fresh fruit was a seasonal luxury. By winter, orchards were bare, and whatever had been stored was often bruised, soft, or starting to spoil. But rural families knew how to turn even damaged apples into a long-lasting, portable food, fruit leather. The process began with windfall apples, the ones gathered from the ground after falling naturally. They were often imperfect, but that didn't matter. Bruised spots were cut away, and the rest was chopped into small pieces. The fruit was simmered in a pot with a little water until soft. Some added a spoonful of sugar if available, but most relied on the apple's natural sweetness. Once cooked, the apples were mashed into a smooth pulp. This pulp was spread thinly on large cloths or baking sheets and left to dry slowly in the sun, on a warm hearth, or near the edge of a stove. In regions with damp weather, it was placed in low-heat ovens or drying racks. Over several hours or even days, the moisture evaporated, leaving a flexible, chewy sheet. Once dried, the leather was cut into strips or rolled tightly. It needed no refrigeration, took up little space, and could last for months when stored in cloth or paper. This simple method turned fragile, short-lived fruit into a nutrient-rich snack that could be eaten in the depths of winter or carried into the fields. It was light, preserved vitamins, and satisfied sweet cravings without relying on sugar rations. Its only real limit was time. Drying took patience, and the process couldn't be rushed without risking spoilage. But for those willing to wait, the reward was a food that bridged the gap between harvests. Today, fruit leather is sold in packets, often loaded with additives. Back then, it was just fruit, heat, and air. A reminder that preservation doesn't always need machines or chemicals. Would you turn what others discard into a food that lasts the season? They didn't survive because they had full cupboards. They survived because they knew how to make something from nothing. Every recipe was a shield against hunger, forged in kitchens lit by oil lamps, using ingredients others would overlook. These weren't just meals. They were proof that survival depends less on what you have and more on what you know. Knowledge doesn't spoil, it doesn't run out. And when the world shifts again, as it always does, it will be the one thing that feeds you when nothing else can. Most of these skills are fading with the last generation who use them. If you let them disappear, you'll be left with only what the store can sell you. And that's not survival. Subscribe now. Not for entertainment, not for nostalgia, but to keep the knowledge alive that once kept entire families standing through the hardest years in living memory.